Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. Marked by the forest, escape was never an option. Day one, the arrival. Ethan and Marcus had chosen this spot for its remoteness. The idea was to disconnect completely, to escape the noise of the world. The lake, nestled deep in a forested valley in Montana, had seemed perfect. A serene body of water surrounded by towering pines, with no roads for miles, no signs of civilization for as far as the eye could see. The trip was meant to help them clear their heads and recover from the weight of life, and for a while it worked. They set up camp by the water's edge, the faint smell of pine and wet earth in the air, the rustling of leaves their only company. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, something felt off. They sat around the campfire, the crackle of burning wood their only sound. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say, just the warmth of the fire and the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. But something lingered in the air, something heavy. The forest had a pulse, a rhythm that was alien to them. As the darkness stretched on, they became more aware of the silence around them. It wasn't the usual silence of the wilderness. This was deeper, almost suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Day two, the growing dread. The next morning, the air was still, too still. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ethan was unsettled, but he didn't want to admit it, especially not to Marcus. But even Marcus, normally unflappable, seemed on edge. The day stretched out slowly. They explored the forest, heading deeper into the trees, trying to shake the feeling that they weren't welcome here. The path was familiar to them, but now it felt different. The trees were too close, the underbrush too thick. The light barely pierced the canopy overhead, leaving the forest floor shrouded in shadows. At one point, Marcus stopped, his eyes scanning the trees as if looking for something. "You feel that?" he asked quietly, his voice strained. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's like we're being watched." They continued walking, but the unease never lifted. By the time they returned to camp, the air had grown heavier. The sky was darkening faster than it should have. The silence was thicker now, almost palpable. That night, as they sat by the fire, something moved in the trees, a rustle, a snap of twigs. Ethan's heart stopped, but when he glanced at Marcus, his friend seemed unaware, lost in the flames. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, voice low. Marcus blinked, then shook his head. Just an animal, probably a deer. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The noise had sounded too deliberate, too close. He stood up, holding his flashlight out into the trees, but all he saw was the black expanse of the forest. Nothing moved. Night to the knock, they lay in their tents that night, but sleep came slowly. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, bending the branches in strange directions. The sound was unsettling, like the forest itself was whispering to them. Then came the knock. No noise, just the oppressive silence. And then, just outside his tent, he heard it, breathing, deep, ragged breaths, slow and deliberate. They came from right outside the thin fabric of the tent, so close that Ethan could almost feel the heat of it against his skin. His grip tightened around his flashlight. He didn't dare move. He held his breath, hoping, praying that it was just the wind, that it was his imagination playing tricks. But the breath was real. Too real. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. Not a sound, not a rustle, not a breath. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. Day three, the unseen force. The next morning, Marcus was gone. He wasn't in his tent and he wasn't by the fire. At first, Ethan thought his friend had just gone for a walk, but the longer he waited, the more uneasy he became. The forest seemed too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. After an hour of waiting, Ethan decided to go looking. It didn't take long to find Marcus. He was standing by the edge of the lake, staring out at the water with an empty, distant expression. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted as if he hadn't slept in days. "Marcus," Ethan called out. His voice was shaky, but he couldn't hold it back. "What's wrong?" Marcus turned slowly, and when their eyes met, it felt like something inside him had snapped. "There's something out there," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse. "I saw it last night. Something wrong." Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. "I heard it too," he said quietly. "It was right outside our tents." Marcus took a shaky breath and looked back at the water. "It's not just that. The whole forest, it's alive. And it's waiting for us to leave." Night 3, the return. That night they sat by the fire in silence. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Every crackling branch seemed amplified, every gust of wind made their hearts race. And then, just as they started to relax, the whispers began. At first, it was so faint they weren't sure if it was just the wind, but as the minutes stretched on, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't in the trees. "Knock!" It was too much. Ethan jumped to his feet, but before he could react, the fire flickered out. The darkness that followed was absolute. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything except for his own heartbeat. And then there it was. Something moving in the darkness, the silhouette of a figure standing just outside their camp. A twisted, malformed shape, like a person, but not quite. Its body seemed to shimmer, as though it were made of smoke, a shadow that shouldn't have been able to stand in the moonlight. And then it spoke. "Leave, before it's too late." Ethan's legs gave out. The darkness closed in, pressing against him like it was alive. He could hear the growls, the whispers, the feeling that something was moving just beyond his vision. They didn't leave the campfire that night. They couldn't. Neither of them could muster the strength. Day 4, the last chance. The next morning, the forest was silent. Too silent. The whispers had stopped, but it didn't feel like a return to normal. The air was thick with tension, as though the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The sun barely broke through the canopy, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Every direction felt wrong. Every path they took led them deeper into the wilderness, but no matter how far they walked, they never seemed to get closer to the trailhead. Finally, after hours of walking in circles, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He spun around, desperate. "We're stuck," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not just the forest, Marcus. We're trapped." Marcus didn't respond. His eyes were distant, unfocused. The creature from last night was still with them, waiting. And that's when Ethan realized. The whispers had stopped, but something worse had taken its place. The forest had begun to move. Ethan's chest tightened as the realization hit him. The forest wasn't just silent anymore. It was watching. It was like the trees themselves were closing in on them, pulling them deeper into a maze with no way out. Every step they took seemed to lead them further into the blackened heart of the woods, but the trailhead, the one thing that should have led them back to civilization, was nowhere to be found. Marcus had barely spoken since that last chilling encounter. He walked beside Ethan, but it was clear he wasn't fully there. His eyes darted constantly, looking over his shoulder as though something were tailing them. Ethan could hear his friend's breathing, shallow, ragged. It mirrored his own, but there was something about it that was unnerving. Marcus wasn't just scared, he was broken. "We need to go back to the camp," Ethan muttered, though even as he said it, he felt the words catch in his throat. He was beginning to suspect that going back to camp might be the worst decision they could make. Marcus didn't answer. The air grew colder as the light dimmed further. The sun had barely moved from its high point in the sky, but it was like the forest had absorbed all of its warmth, leaving only an unnatural chill in its wake. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw it. A shadow. A fleeting movement between the trees. It was quick, too quick for him to make out clearly, but the figure was unmistakable. A humanoid shape, distorted and elongated, with limbs that moved in unnatural ways. It was watching them. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if Marcus had seen it too. He didn't even have the words to speak. He simply grabbed Marcus by the arm and jerked him to a stop. "Did you see that?" Ethan gasped, his voice almost a whisper, but Marcus didn't respond. His eyes were wide, his face a ghostly shade of white. "What? What is it?" Marcus finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan didn't know how to answer. What could he say? That they were being hunted by something that wasn't human? That the forest itself seemed to be alive? There was no logical explanation, only terror. "We need to get to the water," Ethan said finally, as much to convince himself as Marcus. We'll find the trail there." They started moving again, but every step seemed to take them further from safety. The forest closed in around them, the shadows lengthening unnaturally as the trees seemed to lean toward them, whispering in a language neither of them understood. The whispers were louder now, closer. It felt like the trees themselves were alive, their bark pulsing with an energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. The cold deepened. Ethan could see his breath in the air now, and with every exhale it was like the forest grew darker, colder, more hostile. They reached the edge of the lake at last. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the dark sky above like a mirror, but there was no sign of the trail they had followed earlier. No way out. The lake stretched before them, an endless expanse of black water that swallowed the light. The forest pressed in around them, its edges dark and oppressive, as though it were actively keeping them trapped. And then they heard it, the low, guttural growl, deep in the trees. It wasn't the sound of any animal they recognized. It was more like a warning, a promise of something much worse. Marcus's eyes widened in fear. "It's close," he whispered. His voice quivered with terror. Too close? Ethan barely had time to react before he heard another sound. Footsteps, rapid and heavy, moving through the underbrush. It was a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard, like a creature too large to be human, too fast to be anything they could outrun. Ethan's heart pounded as he spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the darkened forest. He saw nothing, but the sound of the footsteps was getting louder, closer and closer still. "Run!" Ethan shouted, but Marcus didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shadows ahead of them. And then, from the darkness, it came. A figure stepped into the light of their flashlights, a tall, gaunt shape that seemed to shimmer with a disturbing, unnatural energy. It was humanoid in form, but bent and twisted in ways that made it impossible to look at directly. Its body was almost fluid, as if its shape was shifting in and out of focus. The creature's face was distorted, a horrifying blend of human and animal features, with a long, elongated snout and eyes that glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. Ethan's stomach twisted as he backed away, his mind scrambling for any way to explain what he was seeing. But there was no explanation. This thing wasn't from this world. It was something ancient, something primal, something that had been waiting for them. The creature tilted its head, its eyes never leaving them. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. And then, in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers, it spoke. "Leave, before it's too late." The words sent a shock through Ethan's body, his legs refusing to move, as if his entire being was frozen in place. Marcus finally snapped from his paralysis and grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him backward, urging him to run. "Run. Now." Marcus screamed. They turned and fled, the sound of their heavy footsteps mingling with the creature's eerie growl as it stalked them through the trees. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. Every fiber of Ethan's being screamed at him to run, to get away from whatever this thing was. But the forest wasn't letting them go. It was like the trees themselves were closing in, blocking their path. The earth beneath their feet seemed to shift, sending them in circles, until it was impossible to tell which direction they were going. The creature was still behind them, its growls and whispers echoing through the forest like a curse. They finally stumbled upon something, an old, weathered path hidden beneath a blanket of leaves. It didn't look like a trail anyone had used in years, but it was the only chance they had. Without a word, they ran down it, hoping it would lead them to safety. But it wasn't just the forest closing in anymore. The earth itself seemed to be shifting. The shadows that clung to the trees grew thicker, darker, and colder with each step they took. Suddenly, Marcus tripped. Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling him back to his feet, but Marcus was no longer looking at him. His eyes were wide, frozen with terror as he stared into the darkness ahead. Ethan followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. The creature was standing at the edge of the path, its shape looming larger than ever before. Its eyes glowed brighter now, filling the darkness with an oppressive light. And then, as if it had been waiting for them to finally see it, the creature spoke. "Leave or die here like the rest." The forest was silent. The air was thick, suffocating. Ethan could feel his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no escape. There was no way out. Suddenly, the creature lunged. Day 5, the mark of the forest. Ethan woke in a cold sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes snapped open and he tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his side. He winced, pressing a hand to the ground to steady himself. It felt like his whole body had been run over, ached in places he didn't even know existed. He looked around, panic settling in his bones. The world was shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the pale moon above, filtering through the branches of the trees like weak fingers trying to hold onto the last remnants of day. He blinked several times, trying to focus, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Where was Marcus? What happened? His throat tightened and he swallowed hard. The events of the night before flooded back to him in painful waves. The creature, the whispers, the creature's words, leave or die here like the rest. Ethan sat up fully, gritting his teeth against the pain. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and as he tried to push himself up, he realized he wasn't lying on the ground, but something far more solid. His surroundings looked off. He wasn't back at the lake. There were no familiar trees. No hint of the path they had been running on. Instead, it was a clearing of sorts, but it didn't feel right. The trees bent in unnatural angles, their trunks twisted like gnarled fingers reaching out toward him. And then he saw it, the mark. A deep, jagged cut carved into the earth beneath him. It was like something had scraped across the ground with great force, leaving a blackened streak that spread out in a wide, circular pattern. There were symbols burned into the earth, symbols that seemed to flicker and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the marks remained, like tattoos burned into the fabric of the world itself. Ethan's breath quickened. He realized with a sickening feeling that it wasn't just the ground that had changed. He felt it in the air, the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on him, suffocating him. And then a rustling in the trees. Ethan whipped around, his body tense and ready to flee. He scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. The forest felt empty, too quiet, and yet he could feel something lurking just beyond his line of sight. It was like the trees themselves were watching him, holding their breath, waiting for him to make a mistake. Where was Marcus? Ethan's mind raced. What had happened to him? Was he still alive? Had the creature taken him? Marcus? Ethan called out, his voice hoarse, cracking from the dryness in his throat. Marcus, where are you? A silence. Only the whisper of the wind through the trees answered him, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was wrong, like the wind itself was trying to speak in a language he couldn't understand. Each gust felt like it was pushing him further into the center of this nightmare. He stood up shakily, using a nearby tree for support. His legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to move. The mark on the ground, the symbols, and the darkened atmosphere, they were all pointing him toward something, toward a place he didn't want to go. But where else could he go? He moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Marcus. The silence was overwhelming. It wrapped around him, stifling any sense of direction, any feeling of safety. The trees seemed to close in around him as he walked, the shadows lengthening and twisting in impossible directions. No matter which way he turned, no matter how hard he tried to shake the feeling of being followed, he always felt like something was just behind him, its presence lingering at the edges of his consciousness. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep, slow, like the earth itself was making the sound, a rumble that came from the core of the forest. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He whipped his head around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible to tell. The growl came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through his bones, rattling his thoughts. He stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he couldn't. There was no way out. The creature was still here, somewhere in the woods, hunting him. He could feel it. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Ethan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. There in the distance he saw a figure. It was tall, too tall, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. The figure's outline was dark against the trees, but Ethan couldn't make out any details. It was like the shadows themselves had taken shape. Marcus, Ethan called out, his voice shaking. Marcus, is that you? No response. The figure didn't move, but Ethan could feel its presence like a weight on his chest. Something was wrong. The figure wasn't Marcus. It wasn't human. The silence around it was absolute, oppressive. Suddenly, the creature's voice echoed through the air, low and menacing. "You cannot escape." The words sent a jolt through Ethan's spine. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding him, drowning him in its cold, eerie tone. The figure in the distance shifted, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, as if it were stretching toward him. Ethan stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the roots of a tree, and he fell hard to the ground. The pain barely registered. His mind was consumed with one thought: it's here. The figure moved again, faster this time, and Ethan could see it more clearly. It was humanoid, but twisted, like something from a nightmare. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, like a broken puppet being controlled by unseen strings. The creature's face was the worst part. It was a grotesque mask of human features, but stretched and distorted into something inhuman. Its eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the moonlight in a way that sent a cold chill down Ethan's spine. Its mouth opened, and Ethan saw rows of sharp, jagged teeth, teeth that didn't belong to any creature he knew. And then it stepped forward. Ethan scrambled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for anything he could use as a weapon, anything to stop it, but his hands were shaking too violently to grasp anything. The creature was closing in on him, its movements fluid, unnatural, and it was getting closer. "You are marked," the creature hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You belong to this forest now." Ethan's mind was reeling. The mark, the symbols on the ground. Everything had led him here to this moment. The creature wasn't just a thing from the woods, it was the woods, a part of it. And he was now a part of it too. He had no choice but to run. With one last desperate burst of energy, Ethan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side. He sprinted forward, the creature's shrill laughter ringing in his ears as he ran through the trees, blindly crashing through the underbrush, desperate to escape. But the forest was not finished with him. He could hear the creature behind him, the ground trembling with its every step, but the shadows were growing darker, colder. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching out like claws, and no matter how hard he tried to escape, he kept coming back to the same place. The clearing. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole, trapping him in its endless loop, a maze with no way out. And then, through the suffocating darkness, Ethan saw it again, the mark. This time he didn't need to look twice. The symbols were no longer shifting. They were alive, pulsing with a sickly glow, and they seemed to be moving, slowly creeping toward him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The mark was his. His name, his soul, his fate. The forest had claimed him, and now he was bound to it forever. The whispers began again. Only this time they weren't just whispers. They were screams, and they were calling his name. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this: some doors once opened do not close so easily.